So, this work comes out of research that I started with my PhD supervisor a number of years ago. Took a little while to get the ball rolling, but it's just been accepted, and I uh, am pretty proud of how this one turned out. So it's comes out of the data that I gathered during my PhD. Well, secondary data, but yeah, the data I've been working on since my PhD. And I'm just going to focus on, I'm going to quickly go over, there's a couple different theses that we look at here. And I'm going to focus a bit more on the intersection of education and omnivorous consumption. So, but I'm also going to talk about the testing of the feminization thesis of sports fandom, which Stacy is sort of a pioneer with my co-author. So in the relevant literature, the term feminization refers positively to the opening up of more opportunities for women to become active sports spectators today in the context of, in Stacey's case, the UK, but in the West more generally. Stacey argues that this process of feminization began in the 1990s and theorizes that this can be attributed to a number of different factors, starting from the 1960s, that with second wave feminism, that have enhanced women's opportunities to engage in a range of leisure activities, including sports fandom. And then with regards to omnivorism, studies in the US also in the 1990s starting in the 1990s, observed that those of elevated social position, especially with regards to their formal educational training, were also likely to consume forms of culture that were more characteristic of other lower social positions. So across the social status spectrum of cultural objects. And this led to the coining of the phrase, the cultural omnivore, by Richard Peterson and his colleagues in the US. And this eclecticism in consumption, however, was necessarily limited to those of higher education and privileged social positions because of the need to also necessarily access both economically and culturally elite cultural forms. And so the consumption of lower cultural forms was sort of both sort of a conscious rejection of snobbishness and sort of reflected, a desire, a cultural capital in eclecticism and being able to broaden one's social networks. And then with respect to voracious omnivorism, Tallycats, Garrow, and Sullivan found that men tend to be more omnivorous than women, although the most omnivorous consumers for both genders are the highest in education and socioeconomic status more generally. This is because women generally face less and more fragmented leisure time to participate in a broader range of cultural activities. And this is mostly a reflection of the unequal distribution of non-employment labor for women and men. It is also claimed that sports following and knowledge of professional sports can serve as a discriminating factor for Canadian women inside employment environments, perhaps especially in business environments. In her Toronto-based case study of a corporate workplace, Bonnie Erickson argues that sports discussions help to build cooperative ties across class levels, but at the same time, women and foreign-born people in the context of Canada know much less about sports, so they are marginalized in the informal networks that both keep companies integrated and help further individual careers. and it is the related dimensions of feminization, omnivorism, and voraciousness in consumption in relation to women's consumption of men's professional sports, the major professional sports leagues in Canada, that this research that we look at in this research. And so we utilized historical and contemporary survey data from the Project Canada survey program from the years 1990 to 2015. This is an academic survey program undertaken by Dr. Reginald Bibby at the University of Lethbridge, and chose the year 1990. It had been, he's been doing it since 1975, all the way to 2015, but we chose the years between 1990 to 2015 to correspond with the parameters of the feminization thesis. The survey asks respondents how closely they follow each of the major professional sports leagues in Canada. So the National Hockey League, which is ice hockey, National Basketball Association, National Football League, which is American football, Canadian Football League, which is Canadian football, essentially American football, Major League Baseball, and Major League Soccer. And with response options of following very closely, fairly closely, not very closely, and not at all closely. The question for Major League Soccer was not asked in the surveys prior to 2015. So just keep that in mind with the graphs and stuff. And the graph here shows the percentage of Canadians who follow to any degree major professional sports leagues split by gender. As has been shown to be the case in numerous countries, a higher percentage of men follow a major professional sports league, 85% of men in comparison to 69% of women in the year 2015. However, these results also show a clear increase in the numbers of women following professional sport in this time period. So 55% in 1990 to 69% in 2015. And the regression trend lines for women and men show convergence over this time. So it shows, a narrowing of this gender gap. So along with asking if feminization is an empirical phenomenon over this period, we ask what are the styles and consumption patterns of women's sports following in Canada, and how do those patterns map onto levels of education and social position and demographics, controlling for all of those factors. And so for this, we use a latent class analysis and found found a 6-class latent class solution, and subsequently utilized multinomial logistic regressions with the largest group as the reference category to assess the predictive power of education, and then controlling for income and demographic variables as well. And the first cluster is the largest one, is distinguished by a high probability of people, the whole sample here is women. So the first cluster is distinguished by the high probability of women in this group to follow all of these sports not at all closely. And so we labeled it the non-sports following group. And so in terms of size, it's almost 40%. And then the second cluster is distinguished by a lukewarm following of the two leagues, the Canadian Football League and the National Hockey League, while the third cluster shows a similar lukewarm following relationship for the NHL and Major League Baseball. But while the first three clusters show like cooler relationships to following, the next three clusters show an increased level of following. So the fourth cluster is distinguished by high levels of following in all the leagues except for the National Basketball Association, the NBA. Therefore, we label this cluster the non-NBA omnivore group. So this is our first omnivore group. And the fifth cluster shows similarly high levels of following, but for all of the leagues. And so it's the moderately voracious omnivore group. So in terms of breadth, they follow all the leagues, but not as intensely as the final group, which shows following for all 6 of the professional sports leagues, and all at very high intensity levels of following. And therefore the 6th cluster of 5%, we find the highly voracious omnivore fan group. And the National Hockey League and Canadian Football League lukewarm follower shows elevated levels of education, with women who have graduate and professional school education more likely to be in this group than those with less than a high school degree. And the NHL and Major League Soccer lukewarm followers do not show any statistically significant parameters for either income or education, although those with the highest levels of education may be particularly less likely to be in this group compared to those who do not follow sports. And only 2% of this group possess graduate education for the National Hockey League and Major League Soccer following group. Similarly, the National Hockey League and the Canadian Football League lukewarm follower is an older group, and the National Hockey League and Major League Soccer group is a comparatively younger group. Our first omnivore group, the non-MBA followers, show the highest levels of income, and members of the moderately voracious omnivore group, the group with the widest breadth of consumption, but not necessarily the most voracious consumption in terms of depth, shows the strongest predicted levels of education by a lot. And finally, the highly voracious omnivores are most likely to sort of have middle levels of income, but and also the third highest proportion of undergraduate education. So in terms of just sort of the first immediate takeaway is that depending on which context, every world context is different, but generally at least in popular, especially European, sociological, intuition, especially back, a few decades, but continuing a little bit to this day, especially in Europe, is that, followers of professional sports would be seen as sort of a pop culture activity and perhaps not be expected to be consumed by those with the highest levels of education. And so at least in this North American context, and I would assume that the US is very similar in this regard, that having a higher level of education actually corresponds to greater following of professional sports. And I'll discuss in a second why perhaps that might be. But then another important finding from this LCA with regards to women's following is that just over 1/4 of all women in the sample, 26%, get this in the slides, are omnivores. And so towards understanding how much feminization has occurred in omnivorous professional sports following in Canada, the graph here shows the results of additional latent class analyses for each year of the survey program that we looked at. And so these results clearly show omnivorism among women growing from 15% of women in 1990 to 26% in 2015. However, unlike following professional sport more broadly, the gender gap in omnivorous following has increased over this period, and there's no convergence between the regression trend lines. So our findings here demonstrate a clear increase in the numbers of women following professional sport generally, and also of being omnivorous sports consumers from 1990 to 2015. That corresponds roughly with the feminization thesis. That time period of feminization corresponding to both general social increases in equality, and then also specific sport-specific reasons why that might be the case, such as stadium renovations that make stadiums more welcoming and comfortable, and also a big decrease in male-centered sports violence over this period, starting in the late 80s and early 1990s. And so thus the results here quantitatively lend support for the feminization of sports fan thesis, which had never been analyzed in a quantitative way before. Stacey is a qualitative sociologist. And so this is true even as clear gender gaps remain in following more generally, although narrowing over time, and especially in more omnivorous patterns of following where these gender gaps have actually increased over this period. Omnivorous consumption generally increasing over this period, partly as a function of media proliferation and ease of access to following a wider range of sports. And so the quarter of women omnivorously following these sports leagues suggests that this sports following space may indeed be more feminized than traditionally thought, and challenges stereotypes that assume, traditionally assume women to lack as much interest, especially given the high levels of commitment required to follow, a wide range of sports. And because men have more free time and are afforded more allowances to engage in serious leisure than women, these high levels of commitment that are necessary for following many sports may also require increased levels of education and or income to achieve for women. Indeed, this is what we see with both of the voracious omnivore groups, along with the National Hockey League and Canadian Football League lukewarm following group represent the groups with the highest levels of education, while the three omnivorous groups of professional sports following are the groups also with generally without low levels of education, either middle or higher levels of education, but of income, but especially high levels of education in terms of undergraduate degrees and graduate and professional degrees. So education is more predictive than income, even though there's an income floor to following a broader range of sports. And so thus it is these four groups generally that represent women, all sports following groups. So the non-sports following group is not higher in education or income than any of the sports following groups. And so it's these four groups that represent women of the highest social position within the data. And so one reason why the moderately voracious sports following group, the group with the widest breadth, but not necessarily the most voracious group, the first reason why that they might be the most highly educated is that generally people are likely to only have a fluency in a few cultural genres, which is within each domain of culture. So for instance, Atkinson argues that people likely only have fluency in a few types of music, like the type of cultural fluency where one can discuss it in a way that accrues cultural capital. And this reason may also apply to sport. The saturation point is likely much more quickly reached for women because of non-employment labor inequalities that limit opportunities to and free time to gain that cultural fluency in as many areas. And the second reason why the moderately voracious omnivore group is the most highly educated is perhaps related, but reflects an instrumental relationship for these patterns of cultural knowledge. So Erickson argues that the most useful cultural resource is a little working knowledge of a lot of cultural genres combined with a good understanding of which culture to use in which context. Equipped with cultural variety and the rules of relevance, a person can navigate successfully in many settings. Therefore, it is a shallow but wide knowledge base of cultural knowledge that is more advantageous than a deeper but narrower set of knowledge resources. And so it is also a way to maximize one's omnivorous consumption for the accrual of cultural capital. And this mirrors, well, and the accrual of social capital. And this mirrors the original arguments of Richard Peterson and colleagues surrounding the omnivore when they emphasize that a passing knowledge of many genres is generally very highly advantageous. And so, again, as Erickson argues in a qualitative study of business workplaces in Toronto, cultural knowledge may be particularly important within workplaces and corporate workplaces and business workplaces. This is perhaps especially true within business specifically because within business, going back to Bourdieu, highbrow culture is generally not looked upon as highly as in other contexts, such as, more cultural capital producing industries. So in more economic capital producing industries such as business, highbrow culture does not have the same type of, cultural capital accruing benefits. And so this dynamic is also reflected, again, in the empirical findings of Bourdieu, where business executives, especially in that work, were generally less endowed with cultural capital resources from highbrow cultural knowledge. And so in particular, sport is the topic most often discussed at work and has been found to be by far the top non-work topic that people report having in common with their colleagues, especially in North America. And it is therefore a topic that can be critical to forming social connections and building an advantageous social network. These in turn lead to promotions and general success trajectories within work environments. And so these types of knowledges, especially broader knowledge bases represented by omnivorous consumption, can be a product and a catalyst for generating valuable social network connections, because contact with different types of people includes contact with different types of cultures. And some previous qualitative findings have shown that women can use their knowledge of sport as a form of cultural capital. For example, in the UK, football or soccer is the national sport, and a knowledge of men's football can be used as a form of communication to give an advantage in male-dominated workplaces, such as business. So whilst it certainly stands that a broader sporting knowledge base will allow for a broader range of social connections, particularly in the workplace, our findings also show that women in all groups followed the National Hockey League, Canada's national sport, at least to some level. Even the non-sporting fans followed at a very low level the National Hockey League. And so perhaps showing a recognition of the importance of this form of cultural capital within Canada as well, in terms of the importance of having at least a base level of passing knowledge and cultural fluency in the national sports. Okay, yeah, give me 2 seconds. And so we generally hypothesize that these findings could be signaling a more instrumental omnivorism by which a passing knowledge of all professional sports leagues is part of a cultural repertoire for women, especially to navigate male-dominated workplaces. And this is one that helps within professional work environments that require high levels of education, especially business ones that are still male-dominated. And it is It then represents evidence or even an argument against voraciousness in consumption. And it is a dynamic that carries much higher stakes for women. And this is the case because both of the need to optimize comparative scarcities, of the need to navigate the relatively treacherous employment environments still.